What's going on, guys? Danny here from Metal Couch, bringing you the first review of 2016, and this is a review that I've been putting off for about 2 weeks now. Megadeth's Dystopia. This is an album that I received a few messages on YouTube about, going like, when are you going to review this? When are you going to talk about this? And I feel like now is the time. 2 weeks of listening to this album, and I feel like I can give a very accurate representation of what I feel about this album. And coming off of Super Collider and 13, I wasn't expecting much. And what I got from hearing some of the tracks off of the album, such as The Threat Is Real, which I did not review, and Fatal Illusion, which I did review and was not very positive about, well, let's just break this album down track by track. I love doing that, dissecting an album. So we have The Threat Is Real to open the album, and this was a track that I didn't review for a reason. It was just a track that I felt like if I were to review it, it would do nothing but upset fans with my thoughts about it, and it was one of those things where I thought, maybe reviewing this wouldn't be a good idea, because if you have nothing nice to say nothing at all, and that's what I have to feel about the opening track of this album. And the opening track of Dystopia establishes a theme that you will find throughout this album, such as a distaste towards how the American government is in the world today. And Mustaine has always been a pseudo-political philosopher, if you will, with his music, dating all the way back to something like Peace Sells But Who's Buying. But it wasn't until the modern era that it became annoying, I should say. Things like tracks like Peace Sells, even though it does have a political message, is still an enjoyable song to listen to, and it is immediate when listening to The Threat Is Real, where the instrumentation lies with this particular album, and that is the fact that Mustaine is absolutely in love with palm muting the low E string on an open note and just going to town. When it comes to riffing on Dystopia, I find, especially with The Threat Is Real being a perfect representation of this, you will find the riffing to be incredibly lackluster, lacks any form of originality and inspiration. And I don't know if that's necessarily because Chris Broderick and Sean Drover left the band while this album was in pre-production, and they hired new people. The drummer from Lamb of God is the drummer on this album, and they have a brand new guitarist too. I can only remember his first name, not his last, his first name being Kiko, which we'll talk about when we get later into the album. But The Threat Is Real is a nice taste of what is to come with this album. And what I mean by that is that this isn't necessarily a positive step for Megadeth. I found this track to be incredibly bland, lacked any form of originality, and shows how Mustaine treats his band in the modern era. Just make a pseudo-political song and make it sound somewhat intelligent to a mainstream audience, and bam, the next thing you know, you're ranking in at peak number 3 on the Billboard 200. Isn't that wonderful? Moving on, we have the title track, Dystopia. Again, completely unmemorable, nothing really much to see here. Again, Mustaine wailing about how America is bad and is going towards a supposed shithole. It's Mustaine being Alex Jones. What more can you expect from him in the modern era? Then we have Fatal Illusion, which I had already covered, which, when I initially talked about this track, the first 50 seconds or so of the song is nothing but discordant noise and is a complete waste of track time. And then to have this whole, like, there's this prisoner who was executed, but he wasn't really executed. He gets up out of the morgue because, and I quote, the coroner didn't fucking care. Again, it's Mustaine using so much cheese to try to make people feel like this is a good thrash album, but it's not. It's pseudo-thrash, and Fatal Illusion still remains a bad song off of this album. My opinion on that song has not changed since release. Then we have Death from Within and Bullet to the Brain. The reason why I group both of these songs together is because they deal with the same subject material, and that is the fact that America is bad and is going to shit. And you're probably going to hear me say this a lot when talking about this album. I don't know what's in Mustaine's head to necessarily make him think that this is some kind of theme that we should be touching on. Like, I don't know if he has some kind of complex where he thinks like he has influence over people to preach about how the American politics are bad. You know, that one thing that everybody in their right mind already knows about, especially Bullet to the Brain. Bullet to the Brain isn't necessarily about American politics. It's more about trying to tap into the title track from Killing Is My Business about a hitman who's, killing people, except it's more on the female side of things. Again, it doesn't really do anything, and it's at this point in the album that I realized that even though Chris Broderick is gone, and don't get me wrong, Chris Broderick is a great guitarist when he's playing his own material, but this new guy, Kiko, is not able to have any form of identity. It's the same problem that I had with Broderick when he was writing original material for Megadeth. All of his solos sounded generic. They had no feeling whatsoever. It was almost as if he were having a solo for the sake of having a solo in the song. And it just completely baffles me that with Megadeth, especially with some of their old albums, like take their first 4 albums for example, not all of those tracks are necessarily great, but you had solos that had feeling and purpose. And then you get to the modern era with things like Death from Within or Bullet to the Brain, and the solos have no meaning, they have no weight behind them, they're just there for the sake of being there because we have to bring solos back into metal music. Moving on. Post-American world. How will we think about America in a post-American world? Mustaine going on about domestic terrorism next. Poisonous Shadows. Poisonous Shadows interested me greatly, not in a positive sense. This is one of a few tracks on this album where it opens up with a whole bunch of acoustic work. And Mustaine's acoustic work has never necessarily been something to write home about. Poisonous Shadows is no exception to that rule, but a change in lyrical tone, moving away from the whole America is moving into a dystopia, was a benefit to this album, if only it became a good song. That would have been nice, but unfortunately Poisonous Shadows is not there. It's almost like on Endgame where you had the hardest part sealed with a kiss, where it was supposed to be an acoustic ballad that leads into a metal song, and you can actually find an interview where Mustaine was like, I wrote this song for my wife and she didn't get it because she thought that I was gonna brick her into a wall. That's how Mustaine deals with his ballads, and no exception here. Poisonous Shadows remains garbage, and I will always stand by that. So then we move into Conquer or Die, which is an instrumental, a very boring instrumental, and does not really add anything to Megadeth's back catalog of great instrumentals. Take, for example, Into the Lungs of Hell. Into the Lungs of Hell is probably the best Megadeth instrumental in their entire history. A great instrumental opening up a great album. And the whole purpose of Conquer or Die is to set up Lying in State, which, according to Mustaine on his Twitter, which you can easily look up, is that it's supposed to be like a whole Holy Wars, The Punishment Due kind of deal, but it falls flat on its face with the fact that it has no impact like Holy Wars, The Punishment Due. Again, going back to the primary problem with this album is that the songwriting is absolutely terrible. This combination did nothing for me. It did not harken back to any of the classic Megadeth, like what I find a lot of reviews talking about, and it's just flat out boring. The Emperor. This is the culmination of everything that I find wrong with this album. This is Dave Mustaine doing a single, a pop-punk song, and it is absolutely terrible. This is as mainstream as Megadeth could get. You could put this on Risk, and I would believe you that it would be on Risk. And this is something that I don't get. I don't understand how Mustaine can sit there and tell all of his fans, yeah, we want to go back to stuff like Rust in Peace and the 80s stuff, and then write a song like The Emperor. Lyrically, again, like the rest of this album, it's absolute garbage. Instrumentally, garbage. This is as mainstream as you can get. You could honestly compare it to a pop-punk song. There's not much of a difference here. And that's supposed to be the album closer. Now, depending on which edition you listen to, you have various bonus tracks. For example, the bonus track that I was giving was Foreign Policy, a cover of Fear, which is a nice harken back to, I guess, the partnership that Mustaine had with, was it V-Ling or Ling V, something like that, for MD45, which didn't really go anywhere. And again, it's a cover. I can't really hold it against the album, but it did nothing for me. I guess it kind of fits in lyrically with what Mustaine's trying to go for, with how America is shit now, but sure, whatever, I'll bite. In conclusion, Megadeth's Dystopia, despite what reviews may say about this album and its chart performance, this album is not good. Super Collider was absolutely terrible. 13 was known as the remake album in my eyes, and was just as bad as Super Collider in my opinion. And a lot of people in the comment section for my modern Megadeth reviews like to go back to what I said when I first started this channel about how I used to praise Megadeth for what they did in the modern era, things like United Abominations and Endgame. But the thing I have to tell them is that times change, and my taste has changed since then, and as I've gotten further into metal, I have grown more of a disdain towards this group and their modern efforts. Dystopia is not a great album, not by any means, and if anybody tries to tell you otherwise, well, there's better thrash out there. In fact, I hear that Vector has recently put out, or is going to put out, a brand new album. If you're looking for a thrash album, that's probably the way to go. But for people to tell me that this harkens back to old school thrash is a fucking insult, and should be taken as an insult to anybody who tries to tell you otherwise. Try to tell you that this is a thrash album. Excuse me. This album's quality, well, it's a bit of a fatal illusion, isn't it? And I can't see Megadeth surviving for the next few years if this is the direction that they want to keep going. Of course, there will be people that are in a younger age group, around 14, 15 years old, about the time that I got into Megadeth, that will defend this album to the death. And there will also be people in my age group who will defend this album to the death. And to those people, I tell you that Megadeth was once good. Peace sells, but who's buying is a great album. Rust in Peace is a monumental thrash masterpiece. Dystopia is not anything like those previous albums. And if I had to give Dystopia a grade, I would give it a 3 out of 10. The production value is there, but the songwriting, lyrical content, and Mustaine's overall performance with this album is nothing but trash. And what a way to kick off 2016. Like, as soon as this album was slated for a January release, I knew what I was getting myself into, because name one good metal album that's ever come out in the dead of January. Metal's all about those summer releases, man, and Dystopia is just absolute garbage. And the real victim here when it comes to Dystopia is their new guitarist, this Kiko guy. He seems like a young kid, very talented guitar player, and the sad part is that he's probably going to end up like Glenn Drover, Chris Broderick, Al Pitrelli, and is going to go the way just right out the door once Mustaine is done with him. Dystopia, not a good album. I await your dislikes. Leave me a comment in the description below about what you think about Dystopia. Again, this is only my opinion. Take that as you will. Danny here from Metal Couch, signing out.